Welcome to Craftsbury's webinar series number 8. We have had webinars thus far from 3 of our 5 Sculling camp directors. So we thought it was time to hear from the coaches of our resident athletes. And so the next 3 webinars in the series will be from the 3 people who have served as head coaches of our various resident athlete programs. This week, Steve Whelpley is going to talk about the importance of language and careful choice of words in coaching. And next week will be Larry Gluckman talking about condition proofing your technique, and Dan Rook will be the week after that, and that will comprise our 3 head coaches of resident athlete programs since 2009 and their inception. So without further rambling, I'm going to turn it over to Steve, and Steve's got the floor.
Okay, hello everybody. I'll let you see me for a second, and then I'm going to share my screen and pull up the PowerPoint that I have, and we'll walk through, and then I'll pop out of that afterwards, so we can do some Q&A. But like Troy introduced, I currently coach the Craftsbury Green Racing Project. We've been both business as usual and unusual at the same time during this COVID. I mean, everyone's fortunate enough that we've been able to train, but we got a lot of hoops that we've jumped through to keep it possible. And, you know, we haven't had a formal race in 6 months, and we might not have another formal race for another 6 months. So a little bit probably of some existential rowing angst for the GRP athletes. But I'll jump right into it. Let me share the screen. Okay, so Sculling Semantics. So I joke, I was an English classics joint major with a concentration in creative writing and a minor in philosophy. So who knows exactly what I was built for, but maybe if I do this long enough, maybe we'll say coaching someday. But so an English major's deconstruction of sculling terminology. I mean, I thought it's fun. I remember when I learned deconstructionism in school, and it's sort of a fun notion to bring to the table and just adds another layer to the sculling semantics. And it's something that's really come true both as an athlete and then as a coach when I watch why people do stuff a certain way. I feel very fortunate, like many of you that have attended the camps here, that I get exposed to, you know, a plethora of different coaches, and every coach has a different style. And so, you know, for one reason or another, somebody is saying what they're saying for a reason, you know? And so I think the proximity to Craftsbury has really allowed me to kind of see that and take better note of it. And I think there's some important power behind it, but I also don't think, even though I offer some solutions through this, I don't think that there's one way that's going to fit it all. And I think you might have sort of a heroic arc to your sculling life. And with that, different semantics might work at different times. So now let's see how I break this open. So first thing is, a different language is a different vision of life. That's Federico Fellini, the director. I think this is going to come into play again at the end of the talk, but I wanted to lead with it, and just meaning the language that we use kind of creates the image and vision that we have for life. It creates what you do, it creates what you see, and how you react to it. Now, making it much more practical of an application, going to a Craftsbury favorite, Steve Fairbairn, frequently referenced by many of the coaches here, Troy and Rick to be 2 of them, but also Noel, Kevin. I mean, everyone probably has their copy of Steve Fairbairn on rowing. And so a good line that he has is, "Don't get into controversies on style, as language is far too imperfect a medium to express ideas." So that's almost like fighting at it and pulling teeth. And Steve Fairbairn is sort of known for saying a lot of things that sound really good, many of which have contradictions within themselves. So, you know, on one hand, he's saying, you know, language is far too imperfect of a medium. But then meanwhile, we have an entire book in his words, in his language, telling us how we should row, you know. So if anything, even though it works against it a little bit there, and maybe it creates a wiggle room for why there's different ways to say different things, and I'm not going to force feed a doctrinal way that I think you should talk about the stroke. At the same time, you know, I think it sort of empowers the idea of language in pointing out its imperfection and yet a tool that we have to use. So semantics, just to define it, I always love throwing out there, and if we're going to have a thing on semantics, we might as well get right into the words. It's a branch of linguistics and logic concerned with meaning. So most simply put, you could say, why do we say what we say? What might it mean when we say it, once it's out there? And so just throwing some stuff out there: body over, body prep, catch, square, hands away, front end, finish, release. All these things we throw out there, and it's terminology. I remember when I first started rowing post-collegiately, I wound up having 3 different jobs. The first job I had was at a law firm, and I was a conflicts researcher, meaning I worked in this department that just researched conflicts of interest in clients they might take on. And, that's where they referred to what I would have thought, in the Matlock sense would be a case. A case was referred to as a matter. Then the next job I went to was for a wholesale brokerage for insurance. I learned some new terminology. And then the next one I went to was in the pharmaceutical industry. And when I went through these 3 different jobs, what I kind of started to realize is how much learning something new is as much about just learning the language used around it as it is learning the actual thing. You just have to learn the lexicon, and then you're sort of empowered to do it. The same thing could be said of even mathematics. Once you learn the language of the math that you're trying to complete, you sort of also have the knowledge in hand. So all these words, I'm throwing out in an unloaded manner. These are just things that we took. I mean, if all of a sudden somebody said catch without really knowing rowing, they'd want to know where your mitten was that you were going to catch with. So stuff that becomes second nature becomes that way for a reason as we go through the learning process. And some of these I think are benign, and some might be rooted in, really elementary stuff. For instance, squaring the blade, we're squaring it perpendicular to the water. And then we're going to put it in the water. And that's like a very logical term to deduce. And it might not be that loaded of a phrase. Some of these other ones might seem innocuous, and we're taught them, but that's sort of where I'm going with this. They might not be quite as innocuous as we think they might be. So here's the first one, and this is one that's for me. I'm going to go through, some are mine, some are other people's, but it's almost like every coach needs to develop a shtick, and their shtick is a matter of semantics, usually, a thing that they want to do. And they express it in a certain way because they really want to convey a point to it. So body prep or bodies over is something that we all do, Troy tells, a legendary story of Mike Tatey talking to a group, and it's like talking about the Olympic 8. And it's like, well, what are they working on right now? And he's like, body prep. It's something that you don't outgrow. And that's why it's a great story about how something seemingly so simple is actually something relatively challenging and sophisticated to a degree. But so why do we say body prep? I think it's an easy cue for the body to be moved relative to the seat. So we got to get these people to orient, instead of just saying, find whatever means possible to get up to the front. There's a lot of stuff behind the fact that sort of sequential movement of the body can do a lot of things right for the stroke, although that's also readily open for debate. But I think there's possible side effects to it. So if we say body prep, it reinforces a static notion of the seat when it's still in motion relative to the shoreline. This is a thing that Rick is really big about, Ricky, that even when we think we're moving in the reverse direction, we're just moving slower. If we're doing anything right, we're just moving at a decelerated rate to the finish line or in the direction of the bow ball, because the whole system is moving. When we get too body centric, we lose sight of the boat. And you're going to see a lot of these cues that I harp on in semantics today have to do with not losing sight of the boat. So I think that's a major thing. Part of what makes it easy is the fact that we talk about moving the body in relation to the seat. But then part of what makes it, dangerous is then all of a sudden it's like the seat needs to be static in time and motion. We get the body forward, and then we can carry on with the next thing. So that's a major danger of it. Biomechanically, I think it also has an effect. You can really see, and this is why I have some of the pictures up that I have, but when people have mobility issues and you say, okay, you got to get your shoulders forward, you got to get more body prep, you got to do this, you got to do that. It actually can make it harder to get front end length and harder to get well prepared for the front end. whether you have good mobility or not, whatever mobility you have, how you access the next position, I think then has in turn an effect on how good you're going to be in that position, how comfortable and how powerful you're going to be. So this reminds me of my college days when I can't even really relate to the fact now, even though I'm still not a Gumby by any means, but in college, all my might, if I did a standing forward fold and I stretched with all my might, my fingertips would barely pass my knees. And I can't believe it nowadays. But, to my dismay, the main technical cue that I heard in college from my coach, Stu Stokes, was Whelpley, flexibility. And I'd be on the water and I'd be like, I was a college kid. I didn't really believe in flexibility being a thing that you could improve that easily, or in the same manner that you could improve strength or aerobic ability and things like that. But when you really fight to get your bodies forward and you do it with your shoulders, it creates a tension throughout your body that's going to make you basically immovable. I hope they don't mind me using the picture, but the two rowers up top, Justin Keane and Eric Frid, both great rowers, but you can see right there the difference in their body preparation. And, Frid has an exceptionally long torso too, the person on the right. And so that can make it also challenging to get over, where Justin Keane has always had, but really works at having mobile hips. And then you can see two other examples below. I actually think I just found it, but I think Nicole Ritchie, who's been working with me for the summer, is the woman on the right. And then we have the current Danish sculler, Sverre Nielsen. Now, if you look at Sverre now compared to what you saw even 2 years ago, it's radically different. Now, he still gets a lot of sort of kyphosis through the back. You can look at the seat. I guarantee you the seat that he's on is this new type of seat made by former Danish Olympians that actually has a very peaked middle of the seat, so that hopefully you can move around on your sit bones more, and it's tilted forward. Despite the greatest efforts of that seat, it's still really hard for him to get over, and it's improved. But he almost always has the pelvis sort of rotated in a posterior fashion. So this is a thing I really hound on as much as I can. And I still slip up, because the easier cue, rather than having a PowerPoint presentation on what I mean when I say hip prep, the easier cue is still for me to say bodies over or body prep when I inherit a new athlete or I'm working with somebody new. But eventually I use it as my shtick that I want hip prep. It's not like by getting the shoulders forward, we're not trying to create a bow in our back that gets loaded under the tension. Really, the point of getting the shoulders forward is so that we actually move our hips forward, so that we're creating a platform to have body swing, And so I think this is getting into a longer talk of it, but why you really want to get over in your hips is so that you can have a strong leg drive independent of a strong body swing that can then be independent of a long arm draw. If you just curl forward, a lot of times it makes it tough to do that. So anyways, I think possible alternatives might be hip prep. If you have somebody that's really aware of their body, you could talk about pelvic tilt. You want to go from a neutral or slightly posterior pelvic orientation to getting over into that anterior position onto the front of your seat. You could even try stuff like slide, then glide. And the slide could refer to a shift on the seat. Sit bones are like what I'd rather people think about their sit bones on the seat in terms of their body prep than where their shoulders are in relation to their hips. If you never move your orientation on the seat, that lets you know what type of body opening you're going to have, what type of body propulsion you'll have. If there's no movement on the seat through your sit bones, then that means you still could get work through your body, but you're not going to be getting it like a deadlift. You'll be getting it like, you just bent over without thinking to pick up a suitcase off the ground and curled your vertebrae forward. So you'll rely on muscles like, the extensors on your back rather than using some of the more powerful systems through your hips. So that's a big one. If I had my way, I would eradicate body prep and bodies over and have it all be hip prep or talk about the pelvis. But that being said, why I said it might be part of your sculling heroic journey is because at some point it may be the easier thing to learn. It might be the easier thing to learn if somebody keeps coming up the slide and their knees are coming up before their hands are even past their knees. You need some of those simpler cues. But what I like about when we make it hip prep or pelvic tilt, we don't necessarily have to stop the seat to do it. We can have that image of burling, the act of when you're, a lumberjack is on top of a log and they're trying to roll it in place. You could be that athletic and that dynamic in it, that you could still have a sense of the seat moving, but you just changing your position on the seat. And this will play into other ones as well. There's a familiar face. And the reason I have Larry Gluckman up instead of a rower is because I think it's pretty safe to say this is one of Larry's shticks, and it's a great one. We use the words finish or the finish position as a reference point, but where does the word finish come from? I think it sort of has its roots in the completion of the drive. So we came up, we did the recovery, we put the blade in, we're driving back, I finished that drive. I finished that drive, I finished that stroke. Possible side effects, though, is it breaks the notion of a cyclical pattern or stroke, cyclical stroke. How often do we take one stroke? I mean, that's a drill that we commonly do. You take one stroke and let it glide. But as soon as you're racing, as soon as you're, doing a workout, as soon as you're doing anything, I mean, a row would not be a very good row if you just shoved off the dock, took one stroke, and then let the wind blow you back to the dock or backed right back in. So I think it's an exceptionally hard sport to get a cyclical pattern established and a cyclical notion to what you're doing. Cycling, possibly one of the easiest ones to do. Bipedal things like running or like swimming, there's a continuity to it that's so persistent that it's easier to find the cycle to it. Rowing has this built-in binary. So if we, between what we're doing in the water and out of the water with the blades, so if we want to make our stroke cyclical, you really have to break down that binary. And I have a lot of tools that I try to do that we could talk about another time. But I think it's important to really not make it like you have one-off strokes. If all of a sudden a 2,000 meter race or a 1,000 meter race or a 6,000 meter race is a home run derby where you just keep taking at bats and each one is you just trying to hit it out of the park, I guarantee you that's going to get beat by somebody that's more efficient, that's tapping it along and finding a more sustainable cyclical rhythm. So the other notion that I threw in is it might inherently stimulate the notion of the micropause at the release. It's like an ever-present discussion right now. We call it the Aussie rhythm. I really wish we could find the coach to attribute it to. The person I most associate it with is Drew Ginn, who's Australian. But micropause can be a great thing, but it's not a great thing if you're doing it unconsciously or if you're doing it purposefully, but with an ignorance for what the boat's doing. You don't gain speed by just happening to micropause. So as soon as you start saying, okay, I'm at the finish, again, it breaks that cycle, and it might wind up creating that micropause. That micropause is only good insofar as you're aware of what the boat's doing and you're doing it for the sake of the boat, which we could go into depth on that too. So what's the possible alternatives? Larry will tell you time and time again, easy possible alternative is the release. Release has a continuity to it. It still means you have an action that's happening. There's still something going on, but it's when, the blade has come through the water, we tap it down and you're both, as I say here, releasing the blade from the water and you're releasing the boat from the drive cycle. Okay. So that's a pretty easy alternative. I think that's like an easier alternative to kind of ingrain in your head. Let's have a release and a release position rather than a finish or finish position. I think that's even more accessible than the body's over, which you still might need to lean on once in a while. Catch placement drills. This is another one. I'm alternating between what some others have kind of taught me and some stuff that I've made up. So catch placement drills are when you're static. You're not going to complete the drive phase at all. You're sitting typically squared and buried at the release. There we go. Squared and buried at the release. And then when you say ready row, you tap the blade down out of the water, carry it across the recovery, and place the blades into the water at the front end. So that's like the simple definition of what catch placement drills are. But I think there's side effects to that. And this is strictly semantics and really kind of terminology, but I think it creates a misunderstanding of what the catch is and how to do it. It draws out a semantical difference between entry and catch. Okay, so this is sort of a divergence, but where I came to this, why I don't want to call them catch placement drills anymore, is because to me, to have a catch, you need to be loading the face of the blade. Okay, catching to me is catching the boat speed on the face of the blade. It's as water starts to form on the front, we start to have the cavity form on the back side of the blade, and it's when we actually begin the propulsion. So it's right where the boat speed meets our speed, and hopefully we do that with as much skill as possible. But that's the catch. So what are we doing on this static drill? You know, if we're not moving at all, are we really catching? Now, some people might say yes. Like if you lasso a catch placement drill just enough and you go a little bit further beyond where you can actually reach biomechanically in your body, there might be a natural rebound that actually loads the blade a little bit, even though you're not pulling through. But I'd rather see them practice as entry practice. You know, I want to just practice covering the blade directly. And I really like this distinction that there's an entry, and after the entry is the catch. As soon as the catch starts coming too soon or too early, then we lose the entry. And in my opinion, we want to have both an entry and a catch to have a good stroke going for us. So possible alternatives, placement drills, just scratch catch out of it. You could call it entry placement drills. Have heard it called roll-ups in other countries. Gary, who's coached the camps from New Zealand, when he was up here, he gave us this interesting phenomenon that whenever they do roll-ups, they do it from bodies over, aka hip prep in my new terminology. And so you just go from there. And so there's actually no handle prep, no arm prep, no body prep. It's just knees up to the front end. That was an interesting thing to learn, but for the sake of this discussion, you could call them roll-ups. But often in my head, when I'm trying to remove catch placement from the word, I stumble across placement drills that hasn't taken, and it shouldn't take. So that doesn't really work. This is a bit of a red herring, a bit of a sidebar, but the note at the bottom on the second catch, I mean, this is I reference it because we're talking about the catch. And I try to use semantics sometimes to empower a point that I want to talk. And I have several athletes that I want to see more responsibility for their body weight when they're coming into the release position. And so I talk about the second catch. Everybody knows about the first catch, which is when we're loading water onto the face of the blades. But the second catch to me is catching your own body weight. It's just unfurled like a fern in spring on steroids. It's just whipped into the bow. The legs went, the body went, and then people just want to sit down in the Barca lounger. And instead of having the boat catch you, you need to find a way within your muscular and skeletal systems to catch your body weight. So I like that. I play on that. A similar example to that, that's a great semantics. It's a homonym going on, is a quote that I have from John Riley, who was a sculler in Philadelphia out of Penn AC. And was pretty accomplished in his day. He still coaches people in the single up and down the Schuylkill. And he loves to say a line that the hardest thing about the single is the weight. And everybody anticipates when he says the weight, and we're talking about the single, that it's the W-E-I-G-H-T, when in reality he means it's the W-A-I-T. The patience for a boat that's moving slower to actually find it at speed and accelerate it out. So semantics. This next one I think is an interesting one, but front end and back end. We often refer to the catch or entry position as the front end, or to the release or finish position as the back end. So I think it's dangerous. It's a rower-centric view of movement that's sort of antithetical to the boat's movement. I hope Rick's watching because he's going to love that statement, I would anticipate. But, you know, unless front end refers to the blade being towards the front of the boat, chances are the way that most people think of the front end is bringing their body to where their eyes are and where their vision is and bringing it frontwards, you know, and that's our front end. And I think that's dangerous You know, and that's, you see it there, bring yourself to the front end. Let's start at the back stops, you know, is what people say. And that reinforces the binary that I was alluding to before, the back stops. Okay, that's where we stopped. That's the finish, you know. The front end, you know, the front end, it's crazy because if we think about that as us going frontwards, well, you should think that that's like the furthest you're ever going to get in that stroke cycle from where the boat wants to go and where you're going to go if you have that attitude. So possible side effects, a similar vein, it's a deterioration of the athlete's knowledge of the boat's movement. So I think it just really detracts from that. I have the aerial view of these two old-timey 8s up because I think from the aerial view is where you really get that sense of like front and back end, but like it gets deconstructed there in the sense of if you're just watching from that aerial view, you know, all you would see is the boat moving out ahead. The work that we would be doing is very different from an overhead view than it would be if you imagine sitting in the coxswain seat and you watch that stroke seat coming to and moving away from you. So possible alternatives are come to the entry, come to the release. You could also refer to as like full compression and full extension. I think that's an interesting one. Full compression and full extension kind of plays homage to our egocentric ways. That gives a cue for the body. But at the same time, what's neat about it to me is you could have compression and extension from a point in the boat that's still moving with the boat. Like you could come, you know, much like that idea of burling, you could have compression and extension that's like actively happening on top of the seat and around the pins rather than, you know, being a more static motion that has to happen independently of the boat. So this is very similar to that, but coming into the stern. So emphasizes a utilization of the slide to come into the front end. Okay, so there I'm saying the front end again. But this is a little different than front end and back end because I think we need even more attention brought to this in the sense that, you know, we don't have, to our chagrin, we don't have sliding rigger boats. I put some feelers out there to track down the last of them, and apparently they migrated to the West Coast, a handful of them. But, you know, we would have a completely different sense of things if you had a fixed seat and a sliding rigger. So with the sliding rigger, the feet and the rigger were attached and they slid. You can still sort of see that image in some boat manufacturers, namely Van Duzen's, where the stretcher is still actually attached, and that's how it goes in. The foot stretcher is attached to the rigger. But we don't have that, and as a result, stuff really gets changed, you know. And then what do we do for cross training? While we have some great tools out there like dynamic erg systems, when we're on a static erg, it reinforces the same thing that happens when we're in the boat without a sliding rigger, which is, okay, we got the seat with ball bearings or dual action seat, and it's made to go into the stern. It's made to wheel us into there. You know, all of a sudden, besides the fact that our vision proprioceptively, we're going to be convinced to move in that pattern, we also have these rails and this practice that we've done over and over again where we're the ones moving. You know, again, it subtracts the thought of the boat's movement. So possible side effects, stern check. That's the most obvious. You know, if you really emphasize coming into the stern, well, you know, chances are you're going to be like a bull in a china shop unless you really tell yourself to come into the stern and land light on the foot stretcher, but it's very hard to do. And again, loss of awareness of the boat's movement or loss of connection to the boat's movement. You know, so there could be a loss of awareness, but on top of that, there could actually be a physical disconnect that happens depending on how you move those wheels into the stern. Like that could actually be a physical lack of connection, not just this mental lack of connection to the boat's movement. You also wind up not engaging your hamstrings, which isn't a huge deal. You know, we want to find ways to be as efficient as possible. I'll talk about the recovery in a little bit. So the recovery doesn't mean that we're a bowl of jello trying to get back to the front end. But we do want to find what muscles we can relax. But that being said, having some hamstring engagement on the recovery can go a long ways towards preventing things like stern check. And it also can give you a better sense if you use your hamstring in unison with the boat surging forward underneath you, that's where you can get this great effect of the possible alternatives. And these are huge for me, but I think 9 times out of 10, most people don't think enough about drawing the boat underneath you, using those heel cups, pulling the heel cups under your seat, and actually engaging with the boat so that the boat, it actually is moving out. The bow ball's been moving all along. You could run with it downhill if you play the recovery just right. The other cool phenomenon is if you had good preparation through your hands and your hips, you actually can bring the front end to you. Rather than the sensation where we're always chasing the front end and it's like, here comes this big moment. I hope the blades are square. I hope they're going to go in together. I hope, and I feel stiff on top of that hope. Now all of a sudden, if you just get prep, bring the front end to you, all of a sudden you feel like a basketball player that can dribble between his legs or behind his back whenever he wants to. So I think this is a really big thing. And what I was going to say is 9 times out of 10, because of the erging that people have done and because of just the mechanical setup of a boat with wheels on slides, it makes it almost inevitable that we have this focus of coming into the stern. I think really good rowing probably has a 50-50 split of actively engaging the recovery so that you draw the front end to you, and passively flowing with the recovery so that you come into the front end. It would be this perfect union. But for most of us, it's like 90% coming to the stern, 10% bringing the front end to us. And so that's why you got to put almost all your emphasis into the other end, in my opinion. And that's where semantics, I think, play a big role in shaping that image for yourself. The first time that people find their heel cups and how to work the heel cups on the recovery can be enlightening for them. So this is a big fundamental one, drive and recovery. And this is an example of like, you might have just had to go this way. So it's a helpful instructional moniker that literally kind of tells us what to do, at that point in time, when you're first teaching the movement to someone. They need to like figure out when they're going to propel the boat. Hopefully it might become intrinsically involved. I mean, like when people grab a canoe paddle and get in canoe for the first time, they don't try to move forward by, ferociously paddling the air. So maybe we need to say it, maybe we don't need to say it. But it's possibly a mnemonic device to teach work, by saying drive, you teach to do the hard work in the water. The side effects, though, again, it breaks the cyclical notion of the stroke. This is what I talked about earlier. We established this major binary, or these polar phases that like are incredibly hard to marry together. And then it also contributes to the unawareness of the boat's movement, because you think that the boat is only moving when you move within it, with the blades in the water. And I think there becomes this subconscious compartmentalization of body movements. Like what we do with our body on the recovery is different than what we do on our drive. Where if you look at this is a classic thing from GB rowing in the top right, the drive phase and the recovery phase, this woman's doing it relatively well, but when you watch really good rowing, if you could somehow take the image of the blade out of it, which I think somebody's actually done with this photo, they've taken like the boat and the blades out from underneath. There's very little difference between how the body moves itself on the recovery and the drive. On the drive, you don't move in a manner that it wildly deflects under the pressure of the boat. And on the recovery, there's still enough organization to it and purpose to it that you would think, oh, they could be doing work right now for all I know. So that's what we kind of want to strive for. In reality, then I have this novice crew below it, where what happens to a lot of us when we are initially taught drive and recovery, and this is a huge gray scale of, what we go through on our heroic sculling journey. But we basically think that we need to look like, Midas Milo carrying the bull on his shoulders, when we're on the drive, and then on the recovery, we're like a fish flopping out of water on land, and we almost get this compartmentalization that's like so counterproductive to really letting the boat have a knowable movement pattern that's going to let it surge forward continuously as possible. So possible alternatives. This first one I think is a great idea to kind of flip it, but you have a propulsion phase and an acceleration phase. And the reason I say that is because when does the boat reach its peak speed? It's actually when the blades are out of the water. So like, let's see if you can run with that downhill, you know? So you have your propulsion phase. That is where you do work and you do stuff, but then out of the water, we can actually keep doing work in the sense of accelerating the boat and moving faster and faster, which is really the end game. You know, I mean, when it comes to sculling, when we remove ourselves from a physiological machine that just lets us know our output, like the erg, then all of a sudden what actually matters is like how you're skating across the water and how the boat's moving. Another option would be drive and glide. I think even the sense of glide needs to have sort of a more active component to it than we might say for recovery, or drive and follow through. That also I might have just thrown out there just for Rick because he loves his hip follow through. But the follow through, like in many sports, whether it's a golf swing or a tennis swing or a basketball shot, you know, whatever it might be, the follow through is still like an action, you know, where we get in our head, it's active, it's purposeful to follow through. Recovery, it's like, well, I did the hard work. Now it's time for me to just flop like a fish, you know? So I think that's a big fundamental semantics that we have to watch out for. Now this diverges from the themes that I had, but I thought it was too good to share, and I see it in my own coaching and I can't take credit for it. But in 2017, after Worlds in Sarasota, there was a coaching conference with a bunch of the coaches that had been gathered that Chris Korzanowski put together. And it was great. And Yossi, they had both Dutch coaches there. And Yossi was phenomenal at talking about the stroke. And he said this one line: posture is everything below the belt, you know, and I knew exactly what he meant when he said it at that time. You know, I had already gone down the wormhole of the pelvic floor and our lower abdominals and transverse abdominis, and that's the real core strength that we need. And trying to convey that to athletes, that it's not like it's not a, you know, concentric compacting of the abs. It's more of a building a column of strength across the abs. But when he said that, it was so good. It means, you know, like to really have good posture, you know, as I sit in a chair, I immediately think of it, and everyone should maybe stop listening to my voice for a minute and wiggle around in a chair and see how you really sit up in a chair, and make sure that you sit up from the ground up, you know, sit up from your sit bones up. And that's what he meant, is that like you can posture, you know, which I would call posturing, but to have true posture, you really need to have a good foundation. So I took that and sort of ran with it. It's a different definition than the corrections done with a ruler in Catholic school or in boot camp. You know, it's not just like, okay, sit up straight, you know, and then people just, you know, pull their spine towards their belly button, arch their back, puff their chest, and there we have it. It refers more to the pelvic floor and strength through the hips. And so I created with the athletes here, like what I talk about a lot is, you know, sometimes you might start with posturing, and posturing to me is a local adjustment to try to make an accommodation for something. So for instance, if somebody is like kind of slumped at the release, it might just be sternum up or keep the sunlight on your collarbones. But to really embed it and make it posture, then you got to find a way to sustain it down low. You know, and what I just did to myself there is I puffed out my core and I engaged my glutes a little bit, you know, and so that to me is a big difference. And when he said it, that was, you know, he was redefining the word posture to me, that then I took it on this semantical journey. So let's get back to Steve Fairbairn real quick for another reference. To get crews to talk over the theory of rowing at afternoon tea and at other times is most educational for them. He had another quote too, where he was sort of ridiculing people that said to not talk about their job work or talk about shop, no shop talk, away from the shop. And, you know, this quote and that quote are basically saying like cultivate conversations about it. And now is where I'm going to head in a different direction. You know, that first part was to kind of show some of the pitfalls of language and some of the stuff that I think both myself and other coaches here have come to. But the other part that's key about the semantics of rowing is how you talk about rowing is going to affect how you row. Oh, like I planned it. How you talk affects how you scull. Now, this goes out to Rick. Now, Rick, but when I told him this was my topic, he reminded me of the elements of style. And I'd say reminded me, but he had forgotten that he had already told me about it in the past. And I'd already picked up my copy of Strunk and White's The Elements of Style. And Rick was telling me, though, the new fact that in this time around, why he picked it up was because of the great coach, Al Rosenberg. Al Rosenberg said, had a huge regard for watching what you say and how you say it. And he actually told Rick to pick up a copy of Strunk and White's, and that got me to do it, which it wasn't, to be honest, when I attended school, it was a new book to me. It had kind of fallen off, at least the school I went to, as being one of the steady books to pick up in terms of writing. But in its final chapter, that's the one that I kind of dwelled most on. The whole first part of it is about semantics, and it's about not just semantics, it's about doing things grammatically correct and presenting yourself well. But then the last chapter is like breathtaking, and it's when it talks about creating your own style. So first it's about the functional style, like what you got to do to be within the confines of good writing, but then it's about finding yourself. And so it opens with this is literally the first line from it. Up to this point, the book has been concerned with what is correct or acceptable in the use of English. In this final chapter, we approach style in its broader meaning, style in the sense of what is distinguished and distinguishing. Here we leave solid ground. That's amazing. When people come, often when people come to the camps, they have a fresh, open mind. But a lot of the athletes I deal with the GRP, they want to know, they want the facts, they want the answers. And I think this says it so well. I mean, trying to get a sense of what's distinguished and distinguishing. And there's almost a comfortable pride, but calmness in the fact that we're going to leave solid ground to find yourself and find your style. So to go with this a little bit, I'm interweaving plenty of English major stuff here between referencing heroic arc like the cosmonic cycle, and here I have the story arc. But if we apply, this had me thinking off of Strunk and White's and applying it to just writing, and then I think we can apply this to rowing as an analogy. Another English major move. But so we start off, you have to learn to physically write. You need to make the shapes. You need to cross your T's and dot your I's. You need to literally learn how to write those symbols, And then as we follow this kind of storyline, you need to learn to spell then, Once we have the shapes and the images, then we need to get them put together to make words. And then we can climax and we're writing our thoughts, Now, I think the challenge really rises from there. You realize that there's a bounty of words and it's hard to ever master the entire language. And then there's the social challenge of communication. How do you convey what you feel you want to say, but in a way that other people are going to understand and get the same sense of it as what you had? And that's ultimately to make you a writer. So as we relate this to sculling and to rowing, I think it's interesting because some of this stuff, the stuff that I went to as semantics, say we take like body prep, maybe you had to learn body prep. Maybe you had to learn drive and recovery. At some point we just need to learn, just like writing out the shapes of letters or learning new words and how to spell. You have to build your lexicon, to go to what I open with. You need to build that proficiency, that technical proficiency that enables you to be aware of what you're doing and why. And then once you have that proficiency, then you can start developing your style and becoming a truly poetic sculler. And that's where I think you wind up finding the real empowerment, the real efficiency, the real cyclical nature of your stroke, all those beautiful things that we're striving for. This is another thing that I had to reference right off of it, and I have two quotes from it. William Pleath, I don't personally know, but through somebody in Craftsbury, Frances Rowell, who's part of the Craftsbury Chamber Players, in a normal year, they do numerous performances from the Rowell family. She lent me this book, which I'm still in the process of trying to transpose everything said about the cello and relate it to rowing, because I think it is so pertinent. But this quote says, this fantasism about technique, this practicing of technique as an end in itself worries me. It severs the thread between the physical means and the music and creates a separateness which is contrary to the nature of things. One would like to see the pursuit of technique, the purely physical mechanical action on the cello, married to a much wider and less fault-building type of practicing. One would like to see students work with the imagination and organization and a real understanding of the validity of the subtler issues. Okay, so I should transpose that right now. And that's a thing. Like a lot of times we come to the sport of rowing and we're like, I just got to get the technique down. You do have to get the technique down, and you need to get a proficiency for it. But if you get it to a point that it starves you of your creativity, then you're never going to find that true marriage between the mechanical action that you have to do and what you want the boat, the end effect to be. The other quote is, technique in its fullest sense means discovering and developing the physical means for bringing into existence a piece of music, or say sculling a boat magnificently down the water. Thus it follows that technique per se cannot exist apart from the music it is meant to serve. People who think in terms of studying technique have made a very small world of technique. You cannot fully learn technique. You can only learn the basics of technique. Real technique is something which only begins to take off when it is caught up in a creative musical idea. So you can move a boat really well. You can move a boat well, for sure, by just trying to hone your technique. But if at some point you don't creatively take yourself out of your own body, take an omniscient look at the boat and really see what you want to quest for, if you lose that creative element, I don't think it'll ever move as free and easy as you want it to. So to relate it back again, you need to shape your stroke. You got to shape the stroke. How you shape your stroke is based on your thoughts. Your thoughts are based on your language. Examples of that are like, this is language that I've heard and I've either used or just witnessed, but like someone will say, get on it. If you say get on it and you want to get on it stroke, you're going to have a stroke that manifests get on it. Crescendo is one, though, that I actually like, and that's one that we utilized a lot during my time as an athlete with the Green Racing Project. And that gave a sense of how we needed to build a drive and build acceleration through the drive. Another one that Troy likes that I say occasionally is finish what you started. And that sounds more robust than it actually means to be. It means like if you get on it too hard at the front end, in my opinion, then you're not going to be able to complete it. Now, it uses the bad word of finish, but it creates an ecosystem that your stroke has to live within that I appreciate. And then niveau. Why do I have niveau? And part of this is like, language can be a very flexible word. And it's a good reference. Well, I've said language this whole time. Language could be a matter of hand signals. Language could be a matter of, feeling. Language could be a lot of different things. It's just trying to communicate what's going on. And the athlete in this picture is Franck, which Troy, myself, and others looked after Franck 2 summers ago now. He's from the Côte d'Ivoire. He is born and bred in the Côte d'Ivoire, and through a fortuitous connection, a guy that works for a bank in Africa met him. He had a rowing background. He randomly went through the Rolodex and found Craftsbury and thought that we could help Franck. And we got Franck over, and he trained with us for a summer, and he went to the U23 racing in Sarasota. And, Franck was not proficient in English at all, really. I think I had a greater command of French than he did of English, and that was not saying too much at all. But we still found ways to progress him, and some of that was hand gestures. And then niveau was one word that I came up with. As I was throwing out words, I Google Translate a word that I thought might be helpful, and then give an impractical thing. I would try to pick and choose stuff from French sculling manuals. Niveau was one, and niveau means level. And he had the common tendency of going high at the entry and pulling down low to his lap. And so I would, keep using the gesture with my arm and my hand of level. And I would say niveau, niveau. And it would be something eventually that actually did get a response from him. And we could at rate say niveau, and he would make a calculated change. So I just wanted to throw that at there in the end, as this is dominated by language. Language is a more flexible thing than we might realize at times. To close, I just have a few things here. I don't know if I can run 2 simultaneously. Let's see what happens. We can do it. So on the left is John Graves 2017. On the right is John Graves 2013. I would argue the reason I'm putting John up here is I know for a fact from conversations I had, from boats I rode with him, that John thinks a lot about the stroke. And I think here, just these 2 quick clips that I found, it's kind of neat to just see a greater and greater evolution to what is John's stroke, you know, and he's always thinking it. He's always, you know, wondering about it and questioning things, and looking into things he could do differently. But one of his greatest things that I think John has is he has a very natural acceleration to his recovery that keeps the boat speed up, but then he has got the precise timing where he's just lassoing that blade in at the right period in time to keep it going. So I put John Graves up because I know for a fact firsthand personally how much he really focuses on his technique and how much he'll engage and talk about it. A person similar that I just met now, and it was from watching a webinar by Rowing Canada, but Max Latimer, who's in their lightweight double. Max, you know, said some remarkable things, you know, about the stroke that were just ways that I hadn't even thought about it before. And when I take a couple of my humble rows now, it really enhanced how I did things. So that's that. The next one is Michelle Garrett. Michelle Garrett, you know, and this is not the greatest footage. It's the Olympic footage just slowed down from her Olympic final in 2008. Michelle Garrett was coached by Charlie Butt predominantly in the sculling boat. Charlie is a very cerebral coach. And what's interesting, and you almost get it less in this slow motion, but she finishes with at best half arm break, you know, and that's something that she's doing consciously. You know, and as soon as you see somebody doing something very consciously, then you know they're actually engaging it. If they're doing it and they're doing it for a reason, then it's going to have purpose. And in this case, that purpose elevated Michelle Garrett to a silver medal at the Olympics. So you can really see how far in front of her body her hands are, but then she gets this great capture in front of the pin. And then Marcel Hacker is another one who I just know. I sat next to him on ergs before and after racing stuff, and then talking to German coaches, that he was like an incredible technician. Here he is. This is very early on with them, but he's playing with the SRD Shimano system, which to me, that's like an interesting reason to put this up. Like he used the Shimano system with the pivoting foot stretcher to try to see how he could augment his technique with it, you know, and you get this immediate sense from watching him that he knows his flow, you know. So as we talk about semantics, I'll also use that as a segue. Larry Gluckman is presenting next week. He might have put this up himself. It is pirated from his blog, but this is another one of Larry's semantics. Practice makes people anticipate perfect, and he purposefully says permanent. So just another example of the empowerment of it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And we can open for questions.
Awesome. Okay, thanks, Steve. And it's a perfect note to end on because Larry will be picking up the webinar series next week. So stay tuned for the announcement of that. I have a couple questions that people have sent to me. Everyone who's still here, please feel free to continue sending me questions as we go through the Q&A. But I'll go with the first one that I got about halfway through your presentation, which came from Scott Baker. And he asked if you had any thoughts about what the phrase tap down at the release connotes, and if there's any alternative terminology for feathering that you would recommend.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think there's a similar thing. Obviously, a tap down refers to moving the hands vertically at the back end so that we take the blade out of the water, right? But at the same time, it's tricky because that, like a lot of the other things I pointed out, I think kind of cultivates a sense of stopping, you know, a sense of changing direction. So I could see that. And I mean, you know, sometimes, you know, it helps to string other words along with it, like tap down, then around, or tap down and around. You know, you could keep it in motion with the other cues that you're saying. But the other weird thing that I would throw out there is, and this is something that has really come true for me this summer, is I think the front end, you want to row to a point, and at the back end, you want to create shape. This is just like almost everyone. What we usually do is we often create too much of a motion at the front end, you know, big sweeping circles of the hands to place the blades deep. When in reality, we want those hands to just kind of steadily rise. And when they apex, it's such a subtle apex that you're like, oh, geez, I didn't even know the blade was in the water already. That would be ideal for the front end. And that's often where we stop the boat more, I think. Whereas at the back end, a lot of times people have a tendency to pull down to the lap. So I almost want to create that by creating shape. I say that to athletes, and then I wish they would let me know they had no clue what I meant by creating shape. But I actually want to kind of cultivate pulling in high, tapping down, and then moving away, because I think often we row to a point, or we scull to a point at the back end while we scull to a shape at the front end. And I think a lot of times the boat would benefit from the reverse. So that's sort of indirect, but I think there's things you can do. You could keep the sentence rolling if tap down is effective for you, but you don't want to have the sense of slowing. You could, put it into a clause that keeps the boat moving out there. But in my personal opinion, a lot of times I think people need to create a little bit more shape at the release and a little less shape at the front end. So I'm not necessarily opposed to it as much as I'm opposed to the boat, any sense of stoppage.
Cool. So here's a question sort of at the other end of the stroke, asking if you could share just a little more on what you want your athletes to strive for or to recognize at the entry and then at the catch.
Oh, the difference between the two, the entry and the catch. So I did mention I could get into it a little bit more. And what for me it happens is I love to periodically, and I know this happens at the sculling camps too, but I like to periodically quiz the athletes I'm working with on where does this theoretical drive phase begin and end, and where does the recovery begin and end. And what I like to define in order to create the elements of the stroke that I would like and to kind of have more of a cyclical nature is I purposefully, rather than have them bookended where everyone expects, I like to shift it over a little bit. So for me, the entry, I like to have be completely associated with the recovery. So we actually recover the blades to the water. That would be another kind of semantical thing you could say. The recovery is not about you at all. It's about recovering the blades back from whence they came, of some senses. But why I like that is if you tie the entry into the recovery, you get so much speed with relaxation and you get length with relaxation. If we come up, ready to hit that ball out of the park and you're coming into the front end like this, your hands will barely ever leave the gunnels, as you squeeze those handles. And so I like to put the entry as the conclusion of the recovery, and then the drive doesn't actually start until the catch. And I want the catch to be sort of this 50-50 marriage where you're both a leader and a follower at once. You're taking feedback from the boat on speed at which it's moving from the last stroke, but at the same time you're trying to assert yourself. It's like I've heard coaches here say it's like a good handshake. You're not coming into that catch and going to just give it a death grip that crunches all the metatarsals of the other metacarpals, of the other hand. You're coming in to both see how firm they're going to shake, but also let them know how firm you're willing to shake. So that's where I kind of create that space. And again, that's where I think semantics can be huge, because even though as we get better and better, the window between the entry and the catch hopefully gets smaller and smaller for people. I think almost all of us need to create that patience and that time and that space to actually let the boat breathe as we enter the water, rather than coming in too assertive, with the blades into the water.
A question just came in asking if you could elaborate on what you mean by working the heel cups.
Working the heel cups. Well, so I think it's an interesting thing to feel, and depending on it might even matter what your shoe manufacturer is, honestly, because the shoes will feel different. But if this hand represents the heel cup and this hand represents my heel, ideally when we completed the drive phase, we still had some type of pressure on the bottom of our feet onto the footboard, ideally. But then if we want to somehow transition, the boat's still running out. This is where I'm trying to say, if you get your bodies over, you can actually try to find your heel and consciously pull your heel into the heel cup, basically the back end of that shoe. And that's how you want to initiate yourself a little bit up the slide. Just this way, like when you do that, when you watch John Graves like rowing in that picture there, you know, he actually has what I think he really does with an immense amount of skill is he finds those heel cups and gives them a nice little tug. It's not an abrupt tug, but a tug that he picks it up on the recovery, and then he can actually let loose again. So he's in this nice relaxation going into the front end. Now it's a fine balance, because I talked about having hamstring engagement, but you don't want to come up, you know, wrenching your hamstrings and pulling yourself up arduously up the recovery. But you want to have some of this recruitment so that you have that effect of burling, like I was saying, you know, sort of an athleticism to it, that it's not going to be just about your body mass coming onto the foot stretcher. You know, you can find that union between the foot stretcher coming to you and your body mass going to it, so that hopefully you feel a little bit of sort of levitation through the recovery, and you don't save it all for the suspension of the drive.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Steve. Okay, next question. This is, I think, pretty relevant probably to a lot of people in the talk, which is basically going about how to standardize this appreciation of semantics amongst a club or a group of coaches. This person says they've been working for years to rid her club of the word finish, and then hears other coaches regularly reference it just because it's habit, and doesn't want to confuse the rowers, especially new people. So, yeah.
Well, you're talking to the wrong guy for an answer on that one. I mean, I think I probably pride myself a little too much on not being doctrinal, and you know, where I would go with it is you just need to be sure. And I don't think I'm there yet. I can see all of my flaws as a coach for not having every word come out of my mouth be the exact one that I wanted at that time or the most purposeful. But like I alluded to a few times during the presentation, is I think at different times, different things might serve a purpose. You know, what lesson do you really teach, say, a novice sculler if you crack down on them for like, that's not the finish, that's the release, you know, like until there's a certain level of built up proficiency that might not really they might not be ready for that lesson just yet. I was trying to think there was somebody who was just recently that I met who was telling me about when they teach novices how to row, they do 5 minutes on an erg, no handle, 5 minutes on the erg with a handle, then 5 minutes on a dock box, and then they go out in the boat. But they never talk about pulling, because they feel that they will get the sense enough once the boat's moving, that'll be built in, and they will get the sense of it on their own. So when I heard that purposefulness to this little crash course for a beginner, that sort of was another eye opener for me, that different things at different times really might have a better function for one person than another. So even though I threw out a lot of things here that are my shticks now, or shticks of coaches that I work with that I really appreciate, what I appreciate is the understanding that surrounds it, not the exact word itself, you know.
Okay, awesome. Question from Barbara Hogan asking if you could comment on the term leverage used in the description of the early part of the drive.
I saw that, and I love that she asked that question, because that's a new semantical thing that I'm going down right now. Leverage is something that's commonly used, loading is commonly used, and suspension is commonly used. And I'm actually in the current process in my head of wanting to define those in a manner that I think will help people be better scullers. And so why I say that is, at some point people need to learn to do that. There's a classic thing when you first start rowing, maybe people have done it, but where you have somebody either hold your erg handle, or it gets restrained with a boat strap so the handle can't move. And then you tell them to suspend and they stand up. Or people, you know, do the crazy drill of, you'll be in the boat and it'll be like, okay, put the blades in and I want you to stand up in the boat, you know. Well, that's more suspension than you need, but somebody needed to learn suspension, you know. And so I think there's obviously levers involved, both the levers of our body and the mechanical levers of the boat. But I've kind of wanted to define, you want to find efficient body weight suspension, but you don't necessarily want to find loading and leveraging. I just find with the athletes that I'm dealing with a lot of times that they like, so much of it becomes about loading that they're ironically stopping the boat in the process of it. Where if you want to, if you find just enough body weight suspension to be, to be light on the seat, but not actually get off the seat, and you try to do that with quickness rather than movement, that's what I really kind of strive towards. And it's that hard marriage, and leverage might be the good word that's in the middle. But if you have suspension on one side and loading on the other, as soon as I have an athlete that starts talking about loading, to me, I can see them wanting to just anchor those blades like cement, grab a hold and launch it past, which that's an image that we use a lot of times, like putting a blade behind a pylon and leveraging the boat past. But at the same time, I think often you wind up seeing people stop the boat way more than they do. I mean, we're in motion. Imagine every time that you ran, what happens if you ran every time you took a step, it was like you needed to assert yourself firmly on the ground before propelling yourself forward. Imagine stopping as you run. That's what I see like happening with athletes when they load too much. Leveraging, I think the best use of leveraging is using your body weight efficiently. It can happen more easily than anyone ever expects on the front end, because the handle is on one side of the pin. Your body weight with the twitch of a seat gets sent on the other. So it's like incredibly easy to use the leverage of your body weight and suspend. And people always overestimate how much they have to do, I think, to have leverage on the pin. But I'm still working that one out. Yeah.
Okay, question from a ski instructor who said that sometimes they can get a physical motion across by describing the sensation rather than describing the motion, and asked if there are examples of this in rowing.
Well, I want to know, I want to meet this ski instructor. I mean, if they want to remain anonymous, that's great. But I love that, because I honestly, sometimes I feel crazy up here because we have a score of like wonderful ski coaches and professional athletes along with it too. And yet sometimes I feel like when they overhear our conversations talking about the minutia of the sculling stroke, they think we're taking crazy pills. And I crave, just like I had two references and allusions, to a cello book and then to writing. And I mean, as soon as you find somebody that engages with their practice to that level of mastery, I mean, it's so helpful to hear it across other platforms. So I'm diverging, but I would genuinely like to have a conversation with that ski instructor. But I think there's a lot. That comes with it. And so we talk a lot here about awareness of what you're feeling on the seat and your feet. But then in relation to that, I actually talk a lot about feeling less in the hands. So here's the best example is a common Charlie Butt-ism that I also approve of and like, is that constant pressure equals constant acceleration. And by that, he means that constant pressure could be a lot of places. Constant pressure on the feet, constant pressure on the handle, where it's usually referenced, or constant pressure on the face of the blade. In order to maintain a constant pressure, you need to have constant acceleration. And I do a demonstrative thing with a ball rolling across the ground. And like if it starts one speed and you want to stay in steady contact with it, by the end, that ball's moving faster and faster, right? If you imagine a hoop rolling downhill or a snowball rolling downhill and you want to keep a hand on it at all times, it's going to start gaining momentum. And that's sort of a similar thing that happens with the rowing stroke. And so what I think is interesting, and we have to talk about feeling a lot, is like that's feeling in and of itself. Constant pressure equals constant acceleration. But I think the issue that people face is often, and I did a whole nother talk for US rowing on proprioception, but that needs to feel like nothing at the front end and feel like something at the back end. And that's because of the mechanical system and then the body parts that we're using. So at the front end, like I just talked about in terms of leveraging and suspension, like you're literally, your arms should just be a conduit. Your hands are a conduit. As soon as you twitch that seat, you got to use with very little full mass to move. Another thing that I say is like, if you were squatting with all the weight you could possibly squat, it's still not much compared to, what you have on the end of your oars. Yet when people enter the water, they want to brace for the end of days and brace for ultimate impact, So proprioceptively, we always have to talk about that feeling that like it's got to give them other distracting feelings to have at the front end. Search for pressure in the feet rather than pressure in the hands. We really have to fight the tactile tendency to kind of get too, hands-on with things. And then meanwhile, when you get to the back stops, then all of a sudden, well, we just used our ham hocks. We just used your legs and your torso to do all this work. Now you actually do need to use your hands. There's been a lot of acceleration happening. It's going to feel like more effort. So even though constant pressure equals constant acceleration, the other part of that equation that I don't think Charlie Butt always talks about is that like how that consistency, that constance is felt by you will not be the same throughout the stroke. And I think that's like a critical thing. So I don't know, that's just one major example about how we try to talk about feel. But I think in relation to the feet, we do it a lot, in the seat we do it a lot, just getting the lightness on the seat.
Great. Okay, so I'm getting down to the last few questions that I've been sent. So if you have any and you want to send them to me, please do so very shortly. But Steve, I'm actually going to ask you a question that I came up with as I was watching, especially at the very end, when you talked about figuring out how to communicate with Franck. And also earlier you had referenced the Aussies in the way that they do the catch placement or the placement drill.
Yeah.
So I was curious if you had looked into or just know of how other languages refer to some of these key parts of the stroke that you've been addressing, like what a direct translation of like the German or the Italian term.
That's a great question. That's a great question that I have a huge curiosity on. And when we were coaching Franck here, all I wanted to know was like the French terminology, and yet like I couldn't get enough out of the manuals to figure it out. And when I would ask a native French speaker, I didn't get any real like gems, like, cause I wanted to hear, like you're saying, I want to hear the nuance in translation. Like they say this one word for the catch, but our best translation of that is 3 words. That would be heaven to me to kind of figure out. But that's something I have huge interest in, but I don't have any great ones on hand other than, I am friends with a couple German coaches, and there was this one time, and this isn't precise technically for the stroke, but there's this one time I was in a double with somebody and we were rowing terribly. And the coach we were working with, Gunther Butter, he gave us 3 drills to do. We had to do them continuously for 2,000 meters. We were on a 2K course. So and they were really simple ones. I think for 2K, we had to do delayed feather. For the next 2K, we had to do quarter feather. For the next 2K, we had to row square. And then the last 2K, we were allowed to just row feathered and free. We went from like wanting to just dock and get on shore and beat each other up to being like, wow, that's the best we ever rowed, And so afterwards I'm like asking him, and I'm like, what was that? And maybe he's just pulling my leg, but I have conferred with other German coaches too, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation if we have any German speakers, but methodisch Übungsreihe, which basically meant like, and now I'm forgetting the exact translation, but it basically meant methodical learning. And the whole point of it was, he was pointing out that in the US often he sees us do drills for like 20 strokes and we're done, and he's like, if you actually want to have something have a practical change, you really need to like reinforce it and do it for a substantial period of time. And so like, that's something that we don't even, we probably have something equivalent, but for them, it's like a catchphrase, methodisch Übungsreihe. Sorry if I'm really killing it for somebody. But they have it. That's like a box phrase and an understanding of a way to learn something that we didn't have here. And yeah, I'm craving that stuff all the time. Like the things that I heard at that coaching conference with all the international coaches there, they wanted the coach of the German 8 to describe how he coaches the catch. And it was unclear if he couldn't because of translation challenges or he wouldn't because he didn't want to share it. But Chris Korzanowski kept trying to tease it out of him. You guys have like the most amazing entry and catch of any boat right now, in that it's so direct and yet it's so well timed, and it's not abrasive, but it's purposeful, and yet he couldn't really share it. Good question.
Yeah, translation across like sports, across any field is a super interesting topic. So maybe it'll be something we can touch on more in the future.
Yeah.
Okay, question that just came up when you were talking about the drill. What's the difference between delayed feather and quarter feather?
Delayed feather and quarter feather. So delayed feather is when you complete a stroke in the water, you come out square, and then you feather away onto the recovery. But the whole point being basically that you hold your feathering until you're actually on the recovery out of the water. So like a common call that I'll say with it is, show the colors and then put them away. So like meaning the colors of your blade. So you need to come out square enough that people can see your blade pattern and then feather away from that. So that's delayed feather versus quarter feather. Could also be known as 3/4 square. I mean, that's just where your whole recovery, you emerge from the water and you're just a little bit off of square and then you go in again. So you're holding it consistently that way, where delayed feather, you are completing the feather, but you're delaying the time at which in the recovery that you do it.
Okay, it is just about 5:15, which is basically exactly when we want to wrap up. So I have one question left, which is, I think, probably one of the more fun ones, which was whether, what you think about like which mythological hero or heroine would actually make a decent sculler.
That's not your question?
No, it's not mine.
You're sure? You
I'm
probably have
sure.
an answer. You probably got an answer for it.
I have some thoughts. I've been thinking about it since I saw that question.
I mean, so you have more prep time. I mean, one that immediately comes to my mind is Aeolus. That's god of wind, I believe. And I'm part of why I say that is you want like a strong figure, yet at the same time, if we were picking something like Hephaestus or Hercules or something, there's too much brute force and there's not like there's not a fluidity to it. There's not something that's like sustainable to it. So that's a quick one that comes to mind. But I feel like you could also say Nike, you could say Nike would obviously make a lot of sense. And you know what, honestly, now that I'm in that and I said Hercules and stuff like that, I mean, like there's part of me that I feel like I can see Odysseus in a lot of rowers. There's a certain amount of strength to it, but a savviness and a cleverness to it and a slickness. When you look at people expect to see like hulking muscles on rowers. I still remember a time when I was a collegiate rower and a fledgling, and they wanted rowers to do an ad, a print ad, and my friend and I got asked to do it. And when we showed up, they inquired, shouldn't you have much bigger upper bodies than this? But that aside, I mean, we like in Odysseus, I see a more balanced figure where there's like, a blend of cunning and strength. We have a blend of aerobic and anaerobic and stuff like that. So, but I can see a rower in everybody though, too.
Yeah. I think Odysseus is a great answer. And I'll just take this moment to plug that in a few weeks, I am going to be talking a little more in depth about some ancient mythology and rowing topics. So keep an eye out for that. But yeah, if anybody has any more questions, you should get them in really quick. Otherwise, I think we'll turn it over to Troy if he's still here to wrap things up. But yes, thanks very much, Steve. That was awesome. I felt like I learned a ton. I'm sure everybody else did as well.
No problem. It is tough when you always feel like you're blabbing into a computer screen vacuum, but hopefully people had some tidbits that were helpful.
Yeah. Okay. Not seeing Troy pop back up, so I'll just let everybody know we will get this recording. Oh, there he is. But we'll get this recording up online within a day or two. And then if you're on our mailing list, that will get sent out. It'll also be posted to our website and usually to our Facebook page. And all those same places will also announce Larry's webinar for next week. Okay, back over to Troy then.
Thanks, Steve. I had to step out to the front yard for just a few minutes, but I saw the lion's share of that and thought it was great. So we'll have probably 2 more great ones next week and the week after, and then we'll just keep it rolling.
Thanks everybody.